December 16, 1944, 0630 hours, Mona, Germany. The pencil scratched frantically across the frost-covered page as Hetman Klaus Richa of the 12th SS Panzer Division recorded what would become one of the most terrifying entries in Wehrmacht combat logs. The Americans possess a new weapon that defies all tactical doctrine. Our men are being slaughtered in their foxholes by artillery that explodes in the air above them. There is no defense, no cover. Death comes from the sky itself. Through the morning mist, Tor had just witnessed the annihilation of an entire battalion attempting to cross open ground near Hen. Not by direct hits. Those were rare in artillery warfare. Not by conventional time-fused shells that required precise calculations, but by something impossible. Shells that somehow knew exactly when to explode, detonating 30 feet above his men's heads, sending lethal fragments downward in a pattern no entrenchment could protect against. In 3 minutes, 702 German soldiers had died. The few survivors who stumbled back were in such psychological shock that they could only repeat one phrase. Die Luft taught the air kills. What Hetman Richa didn't know was that he had just witnessed the combat debut of America's most closely guarded secret weapon in ground warfare. A device so revolutionary that it would increase artillery effectiveness by 1,000, save tens of thousands of Allied lives, and fundamentally alter the nature of warfare forever. The proximity fuse, a miniature radar system crammed into an artillery shell, represented the world's first smart weapon. A thinking munition that would prove more decisive in winning the war than any other secret technology, except the atomic bomb itself. The mathematics of its impact would soon become undeniable. Where conventional shells required 500 rounds to destroy one enemy aircraft, proximity-fused shells needed only 155. Where traditional artillery killed soldiers hiding in trenches 5% of the time, proximity fuses achieved 70% casualty rates. Where London's survival against V-1 flying bombs seemed impossible, proximity fuses would destroy 79% of incoming missiles within 4 weeks. But the story of this revolutionary weapon began not in America's laboratories, but in the desperate hours of Britain's darkest moment, when survival itself seemed impossible. October 30, 1939, Exat, England. As the first winter of war settled over Britain, a young scientist named W. but submitted a proposal that would change warfare forever. Working at the air defense establishment with colleagues Edward Sh. and Amherst Thompson, but had conceived something that seemed like science fiction, an artillery shell that could think. The concept emerged from brutal mathematical reality. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 8,500 shells for each enemy aircraft destroyed. By 1939, with planes flying faster and higher, the ratio had worsened. Britain's survival in the coming air war would depend on dramatically improving these odds. But solution: radio waves that would detect approaching aircraft and detonate shells automatically at the optimal distance. But faced a problem that seemed insurmountable with 1939 technology. His radio fuse would need to survive being fired from a gun at forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, operate in temperatures from -50 to +100 F. and still maintain the sensitivity to detect aircraft 70 feet away. British scientists constructed prototypes by June 1940, testing them in unrotated projectiles, essentially rockets, against balloon targets. The tests proved the concept viable, but revealed the crushing technological challenge. No existing electronic components could survive the violence of being fired from a gun. The solution would come from across the Atlantic, delivered in Britain's most desperate hour by one of history's most important scientific missions. September 6, 1940, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond arrived carrying cargo more valuable than gold. Sir Henry Tizard and a black metal deed box containing every major British military secret. The Tizard mission, as history would remember it, represented an unprecedented gamble. A nation fighting for survival, sharing its most closely guarded military technologies with a country not yet at war. The delegation assembled in Washington on September 12, taking residence at the Wardman Park Hotel. For a week, they revealed Britain's technological treasures: radar systems, jet engine designs, explosive technologies, and chemical weapons research. But on September 19, in a conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, British physicist Dr. John Cockcraft presented something special to a young American physicist who had been summoned specifically for this meeting. Dr. Merle A. Tvedt, 39 years old, sat transfixed as Cockcraft explained British proximity fuse research. Tvedt, raised in rural South Dakota, had spent his childhood tinkering with radio sets alongside his friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Just 1 month earlier, in August 1940, Vannevar Bush had appointed Tvedt to lead a new secret section of the National Defense Research Committee, Section T, created specifically to develop proximity fuses. Tvedt's appointment hadn't been random. Earlier that summer, he had been listening to radio reports of the London Blitz with his wife, Winnie. The broadcaster described children being pulled from rubble, entire neighborhoods eliminated in minutes, the desperate inadequacy of British air defenses. Tuve had turned to his wife with tears in his eyes. "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer." Now, in that Washington conference room, Cockcraft was handing him exactly that opportunity. But the British concept, while brilliant, remained theoretical. No one had solved the fundamental problem: how to make vacuum tubes and electronic circuits that could survive being shot from a gun. Cockcraft was honest about British limitations. They lacked the industrial capacity and resources to pursue the massive development program required. America, with its vast industrial base and protected geography, represented the only hope. Tvedt left the meeting with a mission that would consume the next 5 years of his life and mobilize the entire American electronics industry. The challenge seemed impossible. The solution would require innovations that didn't yet exist, manufacturing techniques never before attempted, and a scale of production that defied comprehension. December 1940. Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington, D.C. The mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road had been transformed into the nerve center of America's most secret weapons program. Tvedt had assembled a team that would reshape warfare. Richard B. Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had worked with Niels Bohr; Henry H. Porter, an expert in acoustics; Robert B. Broad, who had studied cosmic rays; Lawrence Hafted, a specialist in nuclear physics; Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research; and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would make him famous, but whose wartime contribution would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced defied every assumption about electronics. A proximity fuse would need to be a complete radar system, transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator compressed into a space smaller than a coffee can. It would need to generate radio waves, detect their reflection from targets, process the signal, and trigger detonation, all while experiencing forces that would destroy any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental challenge: creating vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes, with their delicate glass envelopes and fragile filaments, shattered at forces of just 100 times gravity. The proximity fuse would need to survive acceleration 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked with the Massachusetts hearing aid company, Raytheon, developing miniaturized tubes with revolutionary construction. Instead of hanging filaments from delicate wires, they created rigid structures using techniques borrowed from hearing aid manufacturing. The breakthrough came in January 1942, with Van Allen's mousetrap spring innovation, a mechanical system that protected tube filaments during the massive acceleration of firing, then released them for normal operation during flight. The patent for this device would remain classified until 1947, but it represented one of the most important electronic innovations of the war. Lloyd Berkner achieved another crucial breakthrough in December 1940, developing a circuit design that used separate transmitter and receiver functions. significantly advancing beyond the British auditing concept. His innovation allowed the fuse to detect targets at greater distances with higher reliability, essential for effective combat performance. By March 1942, the project had outgrown Carnegie's facilities. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still smelled of motor oil and rubber when the first scientists arrived, but within weeks, it housed the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Merle Tuve became Apple's first director, establishing a laboratory culture that would define American weapons development for decades. Signs appeared on every wall. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." The technical specifications of what they achieved still seem impossible, even by today's standards. The proximity fuse operated as a continuous wave radar system, transmitting at 180 to 220 MHz, frequencies that in 1940 were considered the cutting edge of radio technology. The projectile's metal shell body served as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna in the nose. The entire system employed an auditing configuration, where a single oscillator tube functioned as both transmitter and receiver, an elegance of design born from brutal space constraints. Inside a space barely 5 in long and 2 in diameter, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, safety mechanisms, and the detonator system. The oscillator tube generated a 70 MHz signal with harmonics at 180 to 220 MHz. When these radio waves bounced off approaching targets, they created interference patterns that varied the oscillator loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 Hz range. These signals were amplified through a 2-stage amplifier, filtered for the specific frequencies that indicated an approaching target, then triggered a thiron gas fill tube that initiated detonation. The power source represented another seemingly impossible innovation. Traditional batteries couldn't survive the G-forces or provide sufficient power in such a small space. The solution came from National Carbon Company, which developed a revolutionary reserve battery using liquid electrolyte stored in a glass ampule. The firing shock would shatter the ampule, and centrifugal force from the shell's spin would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery during flight. This meant the battery had unlimited shelf life before use, but provided full power exactly when needed. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through multiple mechanisms. Centrifugal switches remained open until the shell reached proper spin rate. A 0.5 to 0.7 second arming delay after firing prevented detonation near friendly forces. The sensitivity increased gradually during flight, reaching maximum effectiveness at typical engagement ranges. January 5, 1943, 0800 hours. Southwest Pacific near Guadalcanal. USS Helena's radar detected incoming aircraft. 4 Ike-3 Aval dive bombers approaching at 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell, Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5 in battery, had been briefed on the new ammunition just days before. In the magazine below, gunners loaded shells marked with special green bands, the Navy's indication of proximity-fused rounds. Range 8,000 yards and closing, called the rangefinder operator. Cochran watched the approaching planes through his binoculars. In conventional combat, his guns would need direct hits, nearly impossible against maneuvering aircraft. But these shells were different. They only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target. Commence firing. The first salvo erupted from Helena's guns. The shells traced red arcs across the morning sky, passing near the lead valve. Nothing happened. They were still too distant. The second salvo followed 15 seconds later. At 5,000 yards from Helena, 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The explosion looked different from anything Cochran had seen before. Instead of the shell continuing past the plane or exploding on impact, It detonated in midair, sending a perfect sphere of fragments outward. The valve's wing sheared off instantly. The engine, peppered with hundreds of steel fragments, burst into flames. The aircraft didn't break apart dramatically. It simply ceased flying, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum. Splash 1, called the spotter. The remaining valves broke off their attack, but Helena's guns tracked them. 3 more salvos, 12 more proximity-fused shells. A second valve exploded when a shell detonated 40 feet below its fuselage. The upward-directed fragments piercing fuel tanks and killing the pilot instantly. In the radio room, the combat report was already being encoded. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the report didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's crew. Gunner's mate, First Class Anthony Pui, later recalled, "We couldn't believe it. For months, we'd fired thousands of rounds at planes, maybe hitting one if we were lucky. Now, we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It was like God himself was guiding our shells." Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian present in the Pacific, would write, "The smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. The impact rippled through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed." On August 12, 1942, even before Helena's combat debut, USS Cleveland had conducted the test that convinced the Navy to stake everything on this new technology. In Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser faced 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, sophisticated targets that could perform evasive maneuvers. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It lasted less than 2 hours. First drone destroyed with the second burst of proximity-fused shells. Second drone eliminated on the 4th burst. Third drone obliterated on the 1st burst. The Navy observers were so shocked they canceled the remaining tests and immediately ordered mass production. Admiral William Spike Blandy, watching from Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide. "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." By spring 1943, proximity fuses were flowing to the Pacific in extraordinary quantities. The first 5,000 rounds went to USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the personal supervision of Commander W.S. Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay. Security was absolute. The shells were stored in special magazines with armed guards. Only gunnery officers were briefed on their capabilities. Crew members were told they were special incendiary rounds to explain their different appearance. The statistics from 1943 revealed the transformation. Although proximity fuses comprised only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition fired, they accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The rounds per kill ratio dropped from 58 for conventional time-fused shells to just 155 for proximity-fused ammunition, a 3-fold improvement that would only increase as crews gained experience. Gunner's mate, Second Class Robert Chen, aboard USS Essex, documented the change in his diary. March 1943, fired 300 rounds at attacking Beatties, no hits. September 1943, new ammunition arrived with green bands. Fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals, destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't know. It's the shells doing the thinking now. June 19, 1944. 1,000 hours, Philippine Sea. 200 meters west of Guam, Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington, watching the radar screens fill with approaching contacts. The same James Van Allen, who had developed the shockproof vacuum tubes, now witnessed his invention's ultimate test. The Japanese had launched their entire carrier aviation strength 423 aircraft in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Van Allen had been commissioned in November 1942 and spent 16 months training gunnery officers throughout the Pacific Fleet. He knew every ship was loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. He knew the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and combat were different things. Raid 1, bearing 265 Angels 2069 aircraft, announced the Combat Information Center. Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered, "Launch all fighters." Gun crews to battle stations, as Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations. Those that broke through faced a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything in naval history. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black puffs, each one representing a proximity fuse detonation. Japanese planes began falling like rain. A Zero fighter dove on USS South Dakota 1,000 yards from Washington. Van Allen watched the South Dakota's 5 guns track smoothly, firing measured bursts. The third shell detonated 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode. It simply came apart. Wings separating from fuselage, engine falling free, the pilot's body tumbling through space. It was systematic slaughter, Van Allen would later write to his wife. The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were brave. They kept coming even as their squadrons were annihilated. But courage couldn't overcome technology. By day end, the Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft plus 50 land-based planes. American losses, 29 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents. The one-sided nature of the battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation. They would never again launch a conventional carrier strike. Their next major tactic would be born from desperation. Kamikaze aboard USS Bunker Hill. Aviation radioman Charles Calhoun recorded, "We could see them falling everywhere, in flames, in pieces, intact, but dead." The gunners were laughing and crying at the same time. After 2 years of taking it from Japanese air attacks, we were finally giving it back. The proximity fuses made our guns godlike. October 25, 1944. 0740 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts watched in horror from USS White Plains as a Zero fighter, already burning from anti-aircraft hits, deliberately crashed into USS St. Lo's flight deck. The explosion detonated torpedo warheads in the hangar deck. Within minutes, St. Lo rolled over and sank. The first major warship lost to kamikaze attack. The Japanese had discovered the only way to counter proximity fuses. Eliminate the need to survive the attack. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. A kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still crash into the ship through momentum. The divine wind had begun. Statistical analysis revealed the tactical revolution. Conventional Japanese attacks now achieved only 2% success rates. 23 hits from 1,092 attempts between October 1944 and January 1945. Kamikaze attacks achieved 30% success. 121 hits from 352 attempts. The proximity fuse had made conventional attacks suicidal, so the Japanese embraced suicide as a tactic. But even against kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses proved invaluable. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills, or deflections from 364 kamikaze attacks, a 64% success rate. Proximity fuses accounted for 44% of all 5-gun kills. Without them, American casualties would have doubled or tripled. Gunner's mate William Fomby aboard USS Nashville described the new reality. "The Japs came at us like they didn't care about living anymore because they didn't. Our proximity fuses would blow them to pieces. But the pieces kept coming. We turned a whole plane into confetti, but confetti traveling at 300 miles per hour still hits hard. The fuses saved us from most of them, but the ones that got through, God help those ships." May 11th, 1945, 1,500 hours. Radar picket station 1,560 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Baron J. Melanie of USS Hadley watched the radar screen with growing dread. Kikusui No. 6 was incoming. Over 150 Japanese aircraft in coordinated kamikaze attack. Hadley and USS Evans stood alone at the picket station. the fleet's early warning and first defense. Multiple raids, all vectors, estimated 150-plus bandits, reported the Combat Information Center. Melanie had drilled his crew relentlessly. Every man knew his job. The 5-in magazines were loaded entirely with proximity-fused shells. The gun crews had practiced until they could maintain 15 rounds per minute per gun, the maximum sustainable rate. At 1520, the first wave attacked 12 aircraft from the north. Hadley's guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The proximity fuses began their deadly work. First plane destroyed at 8,000 yd. Second at 6,000. Third at 4,000. The fourth, kamikaze, already burning, crashed 50 yards off the starboard beam, showering the ship with debris, but causing no serious damage. But this was just the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley fought for survival against continuous waves of attackers. The gun barrels glowed red hot, ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced. The proximity fuses never stopped working. Gunner's mate, 2nd Class Robert Eiley, manning gun mount 52, later testified, "They came from everywhere, high, low, all directions. The proximity fuses were beautiful. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later, there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling. Fire again, another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. Wait, 3 seconds. Explosion. Boom, boom, boom. Explosion." At 16:15, Hadley's luck ran out. 3 kamikazes, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions, but still flying, crashed into the ship in quick succession. A bomb from a 4th aircraft exploded in the after engine room. Hadley was devastated. 30 killed, 68 wounded, engineering spaces flooded, fires raging. But the ship survived, and the gun crews kept fighting. Even as damage control parties fought fires and flooding, the forward guns continued engaging attacking aircraft. When the action ended at 1655, Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. Commander Mellon's after-action report stated, "The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes, even damaged and burning. The fuses allowed us to continue defending ourselves when conventional ammunition would have been useless against such numbers." The Okinawa campaign's final statistics were sobering. 1,900 Japanese aircraft in kamikaze attacks, 368 US ships damaged, 34 sunk, 497 sailors killed, 4,824 wounded. Yet post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, casualties would have exceeded 15,000, with over 100 ships sunk. The proximity fuse had made the difference between painful victory and potential defeat. June 13, 1944, 0400 hours, London. The distinctive pulsajet engine sound echoed across the city, a harsh buzzing that would soon terrorize millions. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive impacted in Grove Road, Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians, including Mrs. Carrie Harrison, who became the first London victim of Hitler's revenge weapon. But unlike the Blitz of 1940-41, London now possessed a defense that would have seemed miraculous for years earlier. On June 12, one day before the V-1 offensive began and 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill had made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Against the advice of security officials who feared the technology would fall into German hands, Churchill authorized the use of proximity fuses for London's defense. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, had deployed 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns, British 3.7 in and American 90mm weapons in a defensive belt south of London. Each gun was linked to SCR-58 for microwave radar and M9 electronic gun directors, creating an automated defensive system. But without proximity fuses, even the sophisticated system achieved only 24% success rates in the first week. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving in the filter room at RAF Stanmore, tracked the transformation. The first week was terrifying. We'd plot dozens of V1s approaching London, and most got through. The guns were firing constantly, but hitting almost nothing. Then something changed in the second week. Suddenly, the guns started destroying everything. The plotting board showed V1 after V1 disappearing 10 miles from London. What Hill witnessed was the arrival of proximity fuses flown directly from American production lines. By the second week, gunners were destroying 46% of engaged V1s. Third week, 67%. Fourth week, 79%. The improvement was so dramatic that German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a secret anti-root weapon. Gunner Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the US 184th AAA Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described the transformation. With regular shells, we had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be and when. 1 second off, 1 degree wrong, and we'd miss. With proximity fuses, we just had to get close. The shell would do the rest. It was like going from throwing darts blindfolded to throwing them with your eyes open. On August 28, 1944, the defensive system achieved its ultimate success. Early warning radar detected 104 V1s launched at London. The proximity-fused guns destroyed 96. The RAF fighters got 4. Only 4 reached London. The V1 threat to London was effectively neutralized. The statistics told the story. 9,300 V1 missiles launched at London over 80 days. Approximately 2,340 destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Without this defense, estimated additional casualties would have exceeded 20,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. Churchill would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." December 15, 1944. Antwerp, Belgium. Captain William Hartmann of the 407 SATA Gun Battalion watched the latest intelligence report with grim satisfaction. In the past 24 hours, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V1s targeted at Antwerp Harbor, a 97% success rate that would have been fantasy just weeks earlier. Antwerp was the vital lung through which the Allied armies in Europe breathed. Through its 26 miles of docks flowed 25,000 tons of supplies daily. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany would strangle. Hitler knew this. Between October 24, 1944, and March 27, 1945, Germany would launch 4,900 V1s at Antwerp, more than half the number fired at London. The defense of Antwerp had started poorly. In early November, conventional time-fused shells achieved only 40% success rates. V1s were impacting the port area at a rate of 30 per day, threatening to close the vital supply line. Then in mid-December, a Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp Airport. Its cargo 10,000 proximity fuses, flown directly from Cincinnati on Churchill's personal order. Technical Sergeant Joseph Crack, operating an SCR 584 radar unit, witnessed the immediate change. Before proximity fuses, we track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed perfect data to the guns, and watch our shells explode behind, in front, above, below, everywhere but on target. After proximity fuses, same tracking, same data, but now every gun burst meant a dead buzz bomb. It was like someone had given us guided missiles. The German V1 crews, launching from sites in Holland, couldn't understand what was happening. Launch sites that had successfully delivered 80% of their missiles to Antwerp suddenly saw 90% destroyed in flight. They increased launch rates. They varied launch times. They tried flying V1s at different altitudes. Nothing worked. The proximity fuses destroyed them all with mechanical efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, ammunition handler with the 126th AAA Battalion, described the reality of sustained operations. "We were firing so many proximity fuses that we ran out of storage." Moaning to how far ahead American technology had leaped. Both Germany and Japan pursued proximity fuse development throughout the war, but neither achieved operational deployment, a failure that would prove decisive in their defeats. Germany's efforts were extensive but fragmented. The Luftwaffe pursued acoustic fuses triggered by aircraft engine noise. Rheinmetall-Borsig developed electrostatic field fuses. The Wehrmacht tested photoelectric fuses. Marine experimented with magnetic influence fuses. Between 1940 and 1945, German research institutions pursued 30 to 50 different proximity fuse designs. Dr. Vera Rambovsky, leading German proximity fuse researcher, explained post-war, "We understood the theory perfectly. We had actually provided the British with early prototypes in the Oslo report of 1939, but we lacked three critical elements: miniaturized vacuum tubes that could survive acceleration, industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronics, and centralized coordination of research efforts." The fragmentation proved fatal. While America concentrated all proximity fuse research under MOVE at Section T, Germany had competing programs at Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, Kriegs, Marine, and SS research facilities, none sharing information with the others. Japan's situation was even more desperate. Lieutenant Commander Yuzuru Fukao of the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Research Institute later testified, "We knew by 1943 that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. We suspected some form of proximity fuse, but could not imagine how it functioned. We developed a photoelectric fuse by 1945, tested it once in a dropped bomb, but lacked industrial capacity for production." The Japanese response to proximity fuses was not technological, but tactical. Kamikaze attacks that accepted destruction as the price of reaching the target. It was an admission of technological defeat, trading lives for the inability to match American innovation. Behind the statistics and battle reports were individual stories that illuminate the proximity fuse's human dimension. Maruf carried personal demons that drove his dedication. His father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Merle was 17, forcing the family into poverty. His mother took in washing to pay for his education. The laboratory walls displaying "save time, not money," reflected his understanding that in war, delay meant death. After particularly difficult tests, colleagues would find him alone in his office at 3 a.m., staring at casualty reports from the Pacific, calculating how many lives faster production might save. James Van Allen's transformation from physicist to naval officer proved equally profound. After developing the shockproof vacuum tubes, he insisted on combat duty to witness his inventions in action. Aboard USS Washington during the Philippine Sea Battle, he watched his tubes protecting the sailors he served alongside. "It was the most satisfying moment of my scientific career," he later wrote, "seeing theoretical physics save actual lives." Betty Thompson, assembly worker at Crossley Corporation, discovered only at a 1985 reunion what she had built during the war. "For 40 years, I thought I'd made radio parts. Then they showed us a film about proximity fuses. I started crying. All those tiny components I soldered, they were saving our boys from kamikaze attacks. We had no idea we were building miracles." Lieutenant Robert Cochrane, who fired the first proximity fuse combat shots from USS Helena, carried the weight of that moment his entire life. In a 1975 interview, he reflected, "I knew we were firing something special. The security briefing made that clear. But when I saw that Japanese plane just come apart in midair without being hit directly, I realized we had something that would change everything. It was like being present at the invention of gunpowder." Technical Sergeant Marie Collins, one of the few women permitted inside the Applied Physics Laboratory, worked on quality control testing. "We would test fuses by firing them from air guns, checking if they armed properly. One day, a fuse activated prematurely, nearly killing 3 technicians. We realized then that we weren't just building electronics. We were building weapons that had to be perfect, or Americans would die." The German perspective proved equally telling. Hedman Klaus Richa, who witnessed the first ground combat use of proximity fuses at Monschau, survived the war as a prisoner in 1965, teaching at the Reformed German General Staff College. He would tell his students, "The Americans possessed a weapon that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete overnight." In minutes, centuries of military doctrine became worthless. That is the power of technological superiority. The proximity fuse's impact can be measured in stark mathematics that reveal its decisive contribution to Allied victory. Naval warfare statistics tell the clearest story. Pre-proximity fuse 1942, 500 to 2,000 rounds per aircraft destroyed depending on conditions. With proximity fuses, 1943 to 1945, 155 rounds per aircraft destroyed. Improvement factor 600 to 1,200%. During the entire Pacific War, proximity fuses destroyed an estimated 4,000 Japanese aircraft. Post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, only 650 of these would have been destroyed by conventional ammunition. The 3,350 additional aircraft destroyed by proximity fuses would have killed an estimated 8,000 American sailors and sunk 40 to 50 additional ships. The V-1 defensive campaign provides equally dramatic numbers. London, 2,340 V-1s destroyed by proximity fuses. Without them, based on Week 1 success rates, only 560 would have been destroyed. The additional 1,780 V-1s would have killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and wounded 25,000. Antwerp's defense was even more remarkable. 2,183 V-1s destroyed from 2,394 engaged. 91.2% success rate. Without proximity fuses, achieving only the 40% rate of conventional shells. 1,400 additional V-1s would have impacted the port area, likely closing Antwerp and strangling Allied operations in Northwest Europe. Ground combat statistics from the Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired in 2 weeks. Estimated German casualties from proximity fuses, 10,000 to 15,000. Traditional artillery would have achieved perhaps 2,000 casualties with the same ammunition expenditure. The psychological impact, entire units surrendering rather than face airburst bombardment, cannot be quantified, but clearly contributed to the German offensive failure. Production statistics reveal American industrial supremacy. 2,273,481 proximity fuses manufactured. 87 companies involved. 110 factories operating. 80,000 workers at peak production. $1 billion investment, equivalent to $15 billion today. The cost per kill analysis proves remarkable efficiency. Average cost of proximity fused by 1945, $18. Average conventional rounds required per aircraft kill, 500 at $2 each equals $1,000. Proximity fuse rounds per kill, 155 at $18 each equals $2,790. While proximity fuses cost more per kill, they achieved that kill with 69% fewer rounds, reducing gun barrel wear, crew fatigue, and logistical burden while dramatically increasing defensive success rates. The proximity fuse's importance was recognized at the highest levels of Allied leadership, with testimonials that place it among the war's most decisive technologies. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, provided the most comprehensive assessment. The proximity fuse created a 7-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5 in anti-aircraft artillery in the Pacific. Formed an important part of the radar-controlled anti-aircraft batteries that finally neutralized the German V-1 attacks on London and fundamentally changed the tactics of land warfare beginning at the Battle of the Bulge. No other development save radar and the atomic bomb had comparable impact on the war's outcome. General Dwight Eisenhower's evaluation carried special weight given his strategic perspective. If the Germans had succeeded in perfecting and using these new weapons 6 months earlier than they did, our invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The proximity fuse gave us a decisive advantage at the critical moment. Secretary of the Navy James Forstall declared to Congress in 1945, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift." and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. Admiral Willisking Lee, commander of battleships in the Pacific, was typically direct. The proximity fuse made the kamikaze survivable. Without it, we would have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. General George Patton's assessment combined tactical appreciation with strategic vision. The proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge, but more than that, it showed us the future of warfare. Weapons that think for themselves. Thank God we got it first. Winston Churchill, writing in his memoirs, provided a statesman's perspective. The proximity fuse saved London from the flying bomb. It was a weapon of defense that proved more valuable than any offensive weapon save the atomic bomb itself. The American genius for mass production of complex devices gave us a shield when we most needed it. Even German leaders in post-war interrogations acknowledged the proximity fuse's impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Reunet stated the American proximity fuse made our traditional defensive positions untenable. We could no longer rely on entrenchments and fortifications. It was a revolution in artillery that we could neither match nor counter. While the proximity fuse saved countless Allied lives, its production carried hidden costs that emerged only decades later. The beryllium used in manufacturing proved deadly. Workers at Sylvania,